Welcome to the 8th Annual Seattle Area.
The Seattle Epidemiologic Research and Information Center, in collaboration with the Department of Veterans Affairs, the VA Employee Education System, and the University of Washington Departments of Epidemiology and Biostatistics, presents the 8th Annual Epidemiology, Biostatistics, and Clinical Research Methods Summer Session.
I'd like to welcome you all to the 8th Annual Seattle ERIC Epidemiology, Biostatistics, and Clinical Research Methods Summer Session. My name is Ed Boyko. I am the course director. The title of today's course is Epidemiologic Aspects of Military Post-Deployment Health Conditions, Natural Disasters, and Terrorism. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Greg Gray, who's a professor of epidemiology and director of the Center for Emerging Infectious Diseases at the University of Iowa College of Public Health. Dr. Gray is a retired captain in the U.S. Navy and a graduate of the Naval Academy. He's published 32 reports from epidemiologic studies among Gulf War veterans, and he also served as director of the DoD Center for Deployment Health Research while in the military. The talk today will be on the epidemiologic aspects of military post-deployment health conditions. Dr. Gray.
Thank you very much, Ed. It's a pleasure to be here today. I want to talk to you today about symptom studies of the Gulf War veterans. Before I do, though, it's important to know that we have quite an array of studies of Gulf War veterans. In fact, some 1,100 that are in the peer-reviewed literature at the time of this lecture. There have been outbreak investigations, a number of different registry studies. Symptom surveys is what we'll cover today, and aggregations of symptoms. But certainly healthcare utilization studies, mortality studies, studies of specific exposures, studies of specific diseases, animal studies, and mental health studies. So a very, very rich repository of Gulf War veteran data as of this month, June 2006. I want to show you this nice little diagram that sort of displays the spectrum of illness that have been looked at for the Gulf War veterans, and make the comment that most of the activity, the well-recognized differences, are over here at this spectrum in the mild disease category where we have symptoms in the subject of today's discussion. Many of the studies that involve the more severe, more objective outcomes over on this poll have not really revealed anything that we wouldn't expect from a Gulf War sort of exposure situation. Now, the symptom studies, many of them were prefaced by a tremendous interest in the news media and in various different popular magazines, such as those shown here, where allegedly Gulf War illness, finally an answer, and the Pentagon's dirty secret, the mystery behind Gulf War syndrome, where these articles drew a lot of focus on some rather unusual hypotheses that were put forward to explain the multi-symptom conditions of the veterans and some of their illnesses. This particular study or report in Popular Science advocated that an unusual, very difficult to detect bacteria called Mycoplasma fermentans was associated with Gulf War deployment and illnesses. There were other reports in the literature of veterans who were fine when they went over and suddenly having had a very disabling disease, and the allegation is that maybe they were exposed to some unusual toxin or nerve agent that could explain this. The mycoplasma hypotheses was not only reported in those kind of magazines, but also in various different newspapers, such as this San Diego Union Tribune paper in 1999. And an advocate of this was a particularly well-established academic researcher at MD Anderson, who had published scores of papers in molecular immunology, molecular studies, and then through some family interest decided that he would investigate the illnesses among Gulf War veterans, and sort of departed his field of comfort and his field of expertise, and moved in this new realm of bacteria. The story associated with this was in some ways like a very interesting novel, and not everything that was alleged was published in the newspapers or the articles, but there was some suggestion that the government might have been testing this bacteria in some of the veterans, and this would come out in the veterans focus groups or the veteran town hall meetings, that they were the subject of an experiment in some of the mysterious vaccines they received in the Gulf. This was met with a lot of contention among people that studied that particular agent because they didn't believe it was a pathogen. And this theory, along with other theories, was criticized not only by scientists but also by some scientific reporters. This issue of this magazine calls the whole phenomenon as of 1997 as Gulf War Syndrome. So if we have all these tremendous post-deployment morbidity allegations with these unusual exposures, the question for you today is, how would you investigate these several years after the deployment? I thought maybe we could walk around the room here with a microphone and come up with some ideas. Put yourself in the place of the epidemiologist at the time, and how might you approach this?
Let's do a case control study. Let's take the veteran, do a sibling.
Okay.
A study a brother who didn't go to the Gulf or a sister who didn't go.
Okay, how would you select the participants?
Randomly.
Okay. And from which populations?
Well, that's getting tricky. I think I'd be stuck with people enrolled in the VA system unless I was clever enough to find another way of getting at the population.
Okay. Well, it just so happens that the whole database is available for both the people that didn't deploy and the people that deployed. That's available to you. And so how might you, using those data, pick a population to study? And there are many of these that were done. So there's no right answer. But one of the ways is basically to do just what you said, and that is to take a random sample, probability-based sample, in some subsets, weighted sample of people that were deployed and non-deployed. The Department of Veterans Affairs large study of Gulf War veterans, 15,000 deployed, 15,000 non-deployed, took this tack and administered a survey, and it has their cohort has a number of different studies involved, sometimes involving clinical exams. But what might be other approaches? Instead of just taking a random sample or a weighted stratified sample of the entire population, who might you want to reach out to, considering that pesticides were alleged, considering that some small groups that we heard before were having more and more symptoms?
The first thing you have to do is decide whether the symptom that you're looking at is relatively high frequency or rare. If you're doing a high frequency, let's say 20 to 30%, you can do a cohort study, and you could define your cohort by military specialty or where they were deployed. If you're looking for a rare symptom outcome, like maybe 400 out of the whole 500,000, you can't do a cohort study. You'd have to do a case control study, and you probably can't just rely on VA records. You're going to have to comb all the civilian records wherever people get their medical care.
Okay, excellent. What about the pesticides? How would you approach the pesticide exposure? Well, the question, it was talked about in our side meetings before, but basically Are there any biological markers for pesticide use several years before now? Is there a way you could look at residue of pesticides that was considered? Is there a way that you could enroll the people that were pesticide applicators? Can we figure out, is there a way to study them and as a heavily exposed group? Those kind of thoughts went into these various different symptom surveys. Perhaps some occupations were more likely, for instance, the people that destroyed Camisea, where they had some munitions. Maybe we could focus on the people that did the destruction, compare those with others. So there are different approaches, and there have been many of these studies basically wrestling with these issues of imperfect exposure data and imperfect outcomes. Well, there are a number of different ways to slice these data, and I've selected these, stratifying the data by case series, controlled cross-sectional surveys, cohort studies, and clinical trials, actually alleging that you thought you understood the mechanism or at least the morbidity and trying an intervention to see if the people get better in the clinical trials. There were a number of different case series studies. One of the earlier ones involved cases in the theater itself, looking at what were some of the infectious disease-related illnesses that were common in the Gulf among the deployed veterans. Maybe we could learn something hypothesis-generating-wise from those case series. Himes et al. Published this in 1991. Having administered questionnaires to 2,000 personnel and analyzing their studies, he found that there was quite a bit of people reporting diarrhea. And then later on, another study by Richards et al., looking at similar situation and found there was a lot of evidence of respiratory disease in the Gulf. And then as epidemiologists, what you might be very excited about is saying, well, what if there's a cryptic pathogen that's causing chronic disease later on associated with these acute medical conditions? Of course, that was very much a concern, something that we were hoping for we could find in the Gulf War veterans that would provide not only an etiology, but if you have an infectious agent, maybe there would be a therapeutic intervention that would improve their health and everybody would be happy. But unfortunately, other than an unusual manifestation in a dozen or so people with a leishmaniasis condition, no treatable infectious condition has been found to explain this tremendous increased multi-symptom condition reporting among the Gulf War veterans. So we moved, as a number of you suggested, to controlled symptom surveys. In some cases, these were large samples, broadly dispersed among Gulf War veterans. In some cases, they were samples of convenience. Let's say I'm just going to study the people that come to my VA hospital and some controls. In some cases, they followed these people over time, multiple surveys. Those shown here in yellow were sampled more than once. In some cases, individual groups with specific occupational exposures, such as the Seabees, some of the most symptomatic people early on were targeted with multiple studies because of their unusual exposures. The Seabees motto has to do with both combat and building, and so they have all the different occupational exposures of a person involved in construction, different chemical agents and paint and cement and laying asphalt, as well as all the exposures associated with combat, in many cases getting shot at, and a lot of concern there. So an interesting group. At any rate, these studies a number of these studies are recorded here on this slide, and you can see that they range. The first control study being conducted in 1995 to the most recent one of the French in 2006. So even the best situation, the surveys were taken after much of the media interest in a lot of the publications alleging theories It certainly could have influenced epidemiologically through bias, etc., the responses to these symptom studies. This is another table that sort of summarizes the symptom studies, and it's important to note that the participation rates varied between the studies. So why would that be important? Why would participation be important?
Well, the power size of the
Okay.
population.
All right, good. So power, the more people that participate, the greater power you have to discern a difference, particularly if it's a controlled.
Also bias,
Okay.
how biased your sample may be if some people were excluded, whereas others were included.
Okay. And so how would you might you envision what sort of biases? We use that term, and there are different monikers for types of biases, but let's talk about the potential biases with the symptom-based, self-reported surveys, or what sort of biases might we see?
You might have people joining your study based on both their symptoms and their exposures. So then you might observe an association that doesn't truly exist because people with both are more likely to join the study than people with only one.
Okay. So you might be enrolling people with more symptoms or more exposures. Okay. Well, very good comments. And the people that constructed these studies wrestled with many of these issues: participation bias, reporting bias, recall bias. Anyway, there's a lot of ways that these data could be not so accurate, despite the wishes of some of the veterans to do their proper thing and participating as best they could. When one considers the literature, particularly the symptom literature, which is less objective than, say, some of the harder outcomes like mortality, you're dead, or hospitalizations that were captured for other purposes, one must keep in mind these potential biases, and you must weigh the studies looking at both their participation size and their response rate. So the better studies have a larger participation and a larger response rate, and you think, well, they better represent the target population. There were a number of approaches at reaching the veterans, and those of you that conduct epidemiologic studies wrestle with this frequently. Postal surveys may be less personal than a telephone survey or a face-to-face interview. However, the telephone and the face-to-face interviews are much more expensive, requiring a lot of personnel to execute the studies. And clinical encounters are even more expensive because they involve the medical care system. So the larger the study, the less likely you're going to have the intensive personal contact that would glean relatively less biased data. So some of the strategies that the epidemiologists used were basically to do, in the larger studies, to do a survey and then study subsets of the population more intensively. The goals of the controlled cross-sectional studies are shown here. Chiefly, they were to identify the most frequent symptom patterns, to look for unexposed symptom clusters, and to search for associated risk factors. I want to tell you a little bit about our study. This is one of the largest U.S. studies. We called it the CB Health Study, executed out of the Naval Health Research Center. In this study, we took some of the most symptomatic people early on, the CBs. We targeted them, and we did it based on a preliminary study where we had some clinical evaluations of active duty CBs in 1994. We found in this small study, the first study, that the CBs had a higher prevalence of 35 of 41 symptoms compared to non-deployed CBs. They scored higher on psychological symptom scales, so they had some evidence of severe or of serious psychological problems, and they were more likely to screen for PTSD using imperfect questionnaire-based screening. So our objectives in this larger follow-on study are shown here: to compare the construction battalion personnel, both active duty reserve and separated, that were deployed to the region with non-deployed similar personnel, looking for symptom differences, clinical diagnosed disease differences, chronic disease differences, and cognitive failure, and then try to identify populations for future prospective study. We garnered our target population through working for something called the Defense Manpower Data Center. This center, by the way, maintains databases not only for the Gulf War veterans, but also for the Iraqi war veterans and the people deployed to Afghanistan, Bosnia, etc. So they're a rich repository of epidemiologic data. They identified some 19,000 reserve and active duty servicemen who were associated with CB commands during the period of interest. We used a postal survey approach, and we garnered addresses from a number of different sources. Finding people, especially military personnel, is very, very challenging because they're very dynamic in their geographical location. They move a lot, and sometimes you can't find them. It's the probability of not finding them is greater than if you were studying a civilian population. We use something called modified Dillman methods, and Dillman is sort of a guru, if you will, of conducting surveys, and the methods involved mailing things, an announcement that they were about to receive a survey, sometimes it would involve another little announcement postcard that you haven't completed the survey, a second survey, a third little postcard that you still haven't, and a third survey. So repetitive attempts to get them to complete the survey data, and the most efficient manner known, sort of a Dillman approach, were used. We even included things that we thought would be incentive, photos of the CB Memorial, appealing to their camaraderie, non-monetary incentives like mechanical pencils with a CBs on it, and a telephone calling card. We use something, in a large survey, it's very strategic to try to make your survey reading very efficient. You don't want to have to spend a lot of money on data entry personnel because they're very expensive. If you can automate this, that's a really good way to go. So we use a special software system out of California that would digitally read not only the entrance of darkened circles on a multiple choice questionnaire, but also could read text, character recognition in the survey. We used, in the survey, we gathered data on demographics, family medical history, past medical history, health behaviors, deployment exposure, symptoms, chronic diseases, and we embedded something called a cognitive failure questionnaire. In this survey technique, which involved a lot of help from external reviewers, and took, as many of you know that do research for the VA, took scrutiny from the Office of Management and Budget, multiple IRBs. Anyway, it's a lot of work to get one of these out the door. But we included in here photographs of the medication because at the time of this survey, some 8 or 9 years out, it was easy for the veterans to forget what the pills looked like or what they were called, and so where we could, we tried to jog their memory. So this is a pyridostigmine bromide photograph down here with also called NAP, and this is a ciprofloxacin that some of the veterans received, and then malaria pills, some of them doxycycline, to help them reduce their recall bias. So, to make a long story short, a lot of work, a lot of effort gaining the support of the senior CBs and the high participation resulted in about 69% participation of those that we could reach, or about 11,800 CB respondents. Now, this is only a small I'm just showing here a few of the number of different exposures. There are many more than this, but I show it only to illustrate that the Gulf War veterans compared to the Gulf War era veterans across the board had more more of these exposures. And you know, it's not. It's important to note that you know, a lot of veterans, even if they don't go to Iraq, are exposed to things like diesel, insecticide, etc., depending on what they do with their occupations. It's also important to note that the Gulf War veterans almost across the board reported more symptoms and medical conditions, but especially symptoms, than their ERA veterans, non-deployed veterans. However, the data were not very reliable. We had some 812 veterans fill out the survey twice. Remember, we're sending them surveys and multiple mailings, and they'll say, "Oh, well, my survey must have not got in because they sent it right before we're doing the counts to send the second one in." And so anyway, they filled it out again, thinking the first one got lost in the mail. So we did a random sample of those 824, stratified on some things, to get a feeling of how accurate the participants were with respect to things shown here. And you can see that our Kappa statistics were not real encouraging. Even for demographic variables, you know, age, gender, race, as, you know, there's some changing there, of course, but things are not with respect to age, of course, but we tried to account for those things, but the Kappa statistics in various different categories weren't as high as we'd like. And certainly for symptoms, we had a pretty low Kappa statistic. So the agreement a person would have between the first questionnaire and the second questionnaire was not real good, suggesting that the data are pretty shaky in some ways. And the cognitive failure questionnaire was particularly bad, which could mean it could be influenced by a lot of things independent of the Gulf War exposure. Nevertheless, we found some, we think, are some interesting things. With respect to these self-reported chronic illnesses, the Gulf War veterans had higher reporting than the non-deployed veterans. And with respect to cognitive failure scores, difficulty thinking, your cognitive ability, this is what it's out to measure. The veterans that were exposed to specific exposures that were rather traumatic, direct combat, dead bodies, and killing, had higher mean cognitive failure scores, certainly consistent with what we know about post-deployment sequelae. An interesting finding, how much you interpret this graph. One of our junior research assistants had sort of a different worldview on this, but here we have a situation where your cognitive failure score increased with the number of times you had to don a gas mask. So I wonder if how might you interpret this? Let's see.
If I was a nervous person, I'd want that gas mask on all the time, and I might be a little that way before I entered the service.
Okay, good.
Also, the more that you had to wear a gas mask, the more that you were concerned about, being exposed to various toxic agents. So you probably think there were a lot more toxic involvement in the environment, so you'd be more concerned about that.
Okay, real good.
So I think what you were saying is the level of stress would be increased proportionate to the time. And I would think that's probably a more likely explanation, but I suppose there could be something toxic about the gas mask.
Real good. So 3 different views of the same data. That's very interesting. And that's exactly right. The research assistants came up and said, hey, something's wrong with these gas masks. And anyway, so the exposure data, the self-reported exposure data can be a surrogate for many things: pre-existing condition, stressors in the Gulf, etc. So as far as we know, there was nothing dangerous about the gas mask. There's not been reported in the literature. So, nevertheless, the data could be interpreted that way. The study's limitations are shown here. It's a self-reported data subject to numerous biases. The strength, we had high participation, very large study populations. We had active duty separated and reserve personnel. And we identified a cohort for potential future follow-up. Now, could you say this cohort is representative of all Gulf War veterans? No, you couldn't. It's because it's just one sort of occupational group, albeit a large one, Yeah, and so this, although we identified it, we weren't funded to go on in perpetuity, but Han Khan's study would be more of a statistical, his 15,000 Gulf War veterans, 15,000 controls. Many of us thought that that would be a more appropriate representative sample of the entire Gulf War veterans, although I don't know that he's going on with it. So in conclusion with our Gulf War veterans study, we compared them with other CBs. We found that they had poorer general health if you went to the Gulf War, a higher prevalence of all the 33 medical problems, more cognitive difficulties, and a higher prevalence of 4 physician-diagnosed multiple symptoms: chronic fatigue, post-traumatic stress disorder, multiple chemical sensitivity, and irritable bowel syndrome. The 4 multi-symptom conditions were highly associated with one another. I'll show you those data in a minute. Now, these data are not unprecedented. In fact, almost all the Gulf War symptom studies that were controlled saw the same thing. Gulf War veterans report more exposures, and they have almost across the board more symptom reporting than their non-deployed counterparts. In this study, it was true not only for the comparing the Gulf War veterans with ERA veterans, but also comparing the Gulf War veterans to the Southeast or to Bosnia veterans, people that went into harm's way concerning another conflict. Now, what might explain the difference between the Gulf War veterans and the symptomology and the Bosnia veterans? Or for that matter, what are some of the no one's really touched on this, what might be different about the non-deployed veterans?
Not sure, but I know we were talking about it in the hallway a little while ago. One of the differences is you're still in the States, you're still at home for the most part, as opposed to going somewhere where it's just really out of your everyday realm. It's not something that you think about, even though we do know we can be deployed. You can mobilize me and send me to D.C. from Memphis, or you can mobilize me, send me to Iraq from Memphis, and my mindset will be different.
Okay, so different stressors, that's for sure. Very good. Question or answer back here?
Also, that people who are deployed to certain areas or deployed at all might have different skills or knowledge than people who aren't deployed. And also perhaps seniority might impact whether they're deployed or not.
Okay. Well, let me just throw out one thing. What if you had a serious condition, medical condition? It didn't really cause you to be eliminated from the military, but they didn't feel like you were appropriate for deployment. That's certainly one issue that we think might be different about some of the people that were never deployed anywhere. Go ahead.
I was going to say that there's a whole difference between deployed to the Gulf, deployed to Bosnia, and not deployed. The food supply, the water supply, how often you can bathe, how often you get to change your clothes, the immunizations that only the people in the Gulf War got this vaccine A, and they didn't even know what they were getting vaccinated for. It was just told it was vaccine A. The heat, the studies of what's in the gas mask might be different after you've cleaned a gas mask and with a cleaning solution and then wear it around at 120 degrees. There might be a number of chemicals that boil off into your lungs that are different there than they would be domestically or even in Bosnia.
Okay, real good. Okay, well, anyway, so there are some, we think, some biologically plausible explanations for these differences between types of deployed veterans and non-deployed ERA veterans. But it's important to know that the studies almost invariably agree the Gulf War veterans have more symptoms than their non-deployed veterans. And it's just almost across the board. And we don't think that this is, some of us have put things in the questionnaires like earlobe pain as a indicator of people that were just checking everything. And while there is a little more earlobe pain reporting, in general, we think the veterans attempted to participate in these things very conscientiously. So the differences, I think the consensus is the Gulf War veterans are very much more symptomatic than their non-deployed or their deployed to other areas peers. It's important to also note the multiple symptom conditions that the Gulf War veterans experience at a higher odds ratio in this study, but are sort of, there's a lot of crossover in these diagnoses. Some of our psychiatric and psychology folks can reinforce this, but they're very much related. The illnesses may have to do with your sort of worldview. The gastroenterologist might be more likely to call the same person having irritable bowel syndrome. The psychiatrist might call it post-traumatic stress disorder. But so these monikers, they're somewhat, although they're defined in many cases, many have argued that they're very highly correlated, and it can be a bit confusing. But the multi-symptom conditions we know are not simply acute. They are manifested years and years down the road, as evidenced here by Han Khan's study. So it's a chronic multi-symptom condition situation. Now, in our 1CB study, we found these very high correlations. If you, for instance, reported chronic, or you screened for chronic fatigue syndrome with our imperfect questionnaire, you were also very strongly likely to have evidence through unadjusted odds ratio of having the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, or multiple chemical sensitivity, or irritable bowel, or having just more symptoms than the average person, or having a poor cognitive failure score. So this group of people, although these diagnoses are imperfect, this group of people have multiple conditions, syndromes that set them apart. They last for a long time, and they're worthy of our interest and concern. This is another study not looking at Gulf War veterans, but showing the inner correlations between various different functional somatic syndromes or multi-symptom conditions. And we don't have time to go into this, but just know that this is one of the problems with the science of looking at symptoms as conditions, groups of symptoms. Well, one of the things that people wrestled with in these symptom studies had to do with, well, what if there's a new diagnosis, a new label we could put on Gulf War veterans that we could call Gulf War syndrome? How would we take the available data and search for it? And there have been a number of studies after particularly the first work Dr. Robert Haley put forward in a very small little study of symptoms among one group of reserve Seabees. He postulated a series of 3 factor analysis driven diagnoses that he said were evidence of neurologic pathology induced by toxins. A number of groups went in to validate this finding. CDC researchers, folks in the UK, folks in the DOD, University of Iowa researchers, etc. And some used various different approaches. Factor analysis was the leading one here, but certainly another approach, statistical approach at aggregating symptoms, cluster analyses, confirmatory factor analyses, structural equation modeling, clinical, makes sense to me as a clinician, kind of aggregation of symptoms, and exploratory principal component analyses. And that's a whole body of work that you would need to review with a statistician to really gain a good understanding of it. But I think this summarizes our findings to date, that all attempts to define a condition like this have met with disagreement. You don't find the same aggregation of symptoms from one study to another. The symptom aggregations vary with the different assumptions and statistical approaches. The symptom aggregations among Gulf War veterans appear to be similar to those among non-deployed veterans and civilian populations. So many multi-symptom conditions have overlapping definitions and hence lack specificity, and therefore we really have not identified through this means, a statistical aggregation of symptoms, a unique Gulf War syndrome. Now, it's important to note that the historical data suggests that symptoms, aggregating of symptoms among the deployed veterans goes way back. And here you can see that we have similar aggregations of symptoms from this 1956 post-traumatic or post-combat syndrome in the order of their frequency as we did with the Gulf War veterans. Difficulty completing tasks, cognitive problems, fatigue or lethargy, shortness of breath, etc. Again, looking at some of the historical data, you can get a gestalt of the number of cases of folks that have been compensated with these multi-symptom conditions historically in the literature. And now we're seeing suggestions that maybe some other deployments or catastrophic events could also result in multi-symptom condition that are unique to those, such as a Balkan War syndrome, or recently a question about a Chechnya syndrome. And there's some suggestion that Dutch peacekeepers may be experiencing a syndrome. And finally, allegations, although refuted recently in some work out of with Simon Wesley's group in the UK, the BBC was saying, what about an Iraq War syndrome with those that are recently deployed to Iraq? So we're going to continue to see these manifestations and suggestions that something might be unique to veterans' deployments and result in multi-symptom conditions. But just know that there is a rich historical precedent of these conditions, and they're very closely related and overlapping. So in summary of the Gulf War veteran studies, we found that Gulf War veterans report more symptoms than do other military personnel of the same era. There's little evidence that they are suffering from a unique war syndrome. Some studies have implicated some Gulf War veteran exposures as associated with deployment, post-deployment illnesses, but their findings are not consistent. The etiology of increased symptom reporting is unclear, but consistent with the experience of Gulf War veterans conflict stating, or veterans conflict stating from the 1800s. So today I think I've pretty well covered symptoms, studies among the Gulf War veterans. I hope you'll agree with me that we have invested a lot into examining the symptoms of the Gulf War veterans, and we've learned a lot, but the studies are imperfect, and they haven't been as satisfying as perhaps we had wished, but nevertheless they've helped us develop better systems for evaluating future deployed veterans, and for that reason I think we've benefited greatly. So thank you very much for your kind attention.